German Chancellor Olaf Scholz says his country has provided Ukraine with 18 Leopard 2 battle tanks in line with a pledge made earlier this year. The long-awaited German-made vehicles were handed over to Ukrainian forces at the border. The decision to send them to support Kyiv was made in January, following months of debate. Now, Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine has become a symbol of Ukrainian resistance, albeit one of the bloodiest. Some criticize the Ukrainian leadership for the decision to keep on defending Bakhmut, but many Ukrainian soldiers in the area say they are willing to pay the heavy price for its control. DW correspondent Max Zander went to meet some of those fighters.
You have to move fast. We're heading for the front line. The Russians are very close.
So they're telling us this is one of the most forward position on this part of the front line. From here to the other side, to where the Russian enemies are, it's just roughly about 150 meters.
That's the Russians firing back. The soldier behind the machine gun feels the pressure.
Да, це ощущається. З кожним днем все хуже і хуже.
The enemy is testing them, he says, preparing for something. Snipers and mortars pose a constant threat. Moving anywhere is dangerous. In the next foxhole, we meet a man with a call sign taxi driver. He joined the army when the war began. He hasn't seen his family for months. Yesterday was his son's 6th birthday. I ask him how he copes.
Страшно, страшно. И думаешь ты и о десятках тысяч погибших, и о тех ребят, которые были, блядь, вечером с тобой курили сигарету, и их за пару часов нет. Думаешь, каждый день думаешь. Страшно, конечно, страшно.
Despite all this, the soldiers here will keep fighting. Bakhmut, not far away, must stand. Soldier Slava tells me.
Від самого Бахмута йде дві стратегічно важливі дороги, з яких противник може розвити напрямки на будь-якому участку фронту. Поки що одна із стратегічних об'єктів, плюс у них там зосереджено доволі велике угрупування військ. Якщо прорвуть нашу лінію оборони, вони зможуть розвинути далі в глибину нашої країни.
And for both sides, Bakhmut remains a strong symbol.
Oh yeah, while the enemy is dying, our morale is high. This is it. And if they are stupid enough to sell to Russians victory, like capturing the Bakhmut, in the beginning of war they were trying to capture Kyiv for 3 days. Kharkiv, but Kyiv stands, Kharkiv stands, and now they're trying to sell Bakhmut. You can tell what the second army in the world looked like for real from over here.
Critics, though, argue Bakhmut is no longer worth the price that Ukraine is paying in lives. We're taken to see what that looks like. We can't say where we are, only that the fighting is very close. An abandoned building, now a field hospital. Here doctors work round the clock to save lives. Their position in the danger zone is crucial. Wounded are brought here directly from the front line and stabilized so they can survive the trip to the hospital. This man suffered a shrapnel wound to his abdomen. Surgeon Dmitro and his team get to it immediately. Half an hour later, he is stable enough to be moved. The teams here perform up to 80 operations every day.
The last injured cases, it's 90% it's shrapnel injuries from artillery. And in this place, in this stabilization point, we have also a lot of bullet injuries also, because were provided in a city, and our enemy use close contact to our soldiers, and we have more cases with bullet injuries.
Dmitro ran a company for clinical testing before the war. Now he chooses to be here, in a windowless room that smells of wounds and sounds like war. But they're making a difference, he says.
And we are becoming more professionals, and every kind of staff know what he or she should do in this case. And so we are creating some own protocols for helping.
An hour's drive away from the trenches, Kramatorsk station. Visits from family end here. Wives and girlfriends return to safety, and men head back to the front line. The price for Bakhmut is high, but Ukraine is willing to pay.
And the author of that report, our correspondent Max Zander, joins me now from Kyiv. Let's see if we can bring him up. Max, you just returned from the front line, and we saw in your report the toll the fighting takes on the soldiers. What struck you most when you were speaking to them?
Right, Nico. So when we set out to do this report, essentially we were trying to get a bit of a sense how the fighting in and around Bakhmut is affecting those who are holding the line. And months since they began defending Bakhmut, 13 months into the war, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, what struck me most is that the morale, at least among the fighters we were introduced to, seems to be very high, despite all the hardships, being in these cold, dirty trenches, seeing their comrades die, being separated from their families. They still believe in what they're doing. And we speak about Ukrainian resilience quite a lot. You see it a lot in civil society. You have a lot of stories here, also among the Ukrainian troops. So that's absolutely justified, but I think just from seeing what we saw there, one thing I like to point out that gets forgotten sometimes also is that this is a country that is also suffering, that is heavily traumatized, and that is going to have an effect going forward as well.
You touched on it there. It's death, fear, loneliness, day after day. What did the soldiers tell you about how they managed to keep going throughout this all?
Right, so just regarding the situation in Bakhmut, it appears that the Russians are focusing a bit less, or pouring less resources into the town at the moment, not throwing everything at the Ukrainians that they can right now. So shifting a bit of a focus to a southern town of Avdiivka. So I imagine that seeing this on Ukrainian side will give you a little bit of a boost of morale, seeing that what you said, your sacrifices, that your defense has proven successful so far. But apart from that, I mean, having good equipment, having good leadership makes a big impact on morale for sure. And then also when you speak to soldiers and ask them why they are doing this, they tell you they don't want an inch of land to go to the Russians. They don't want the territory to fall into Russian hands in order to protect the civil population, in order to not see what we saw, for example, in Bucha and other places of Ukraine, the torture, murder of civilians and rapes and keep the country safe and keep the country Ukrainian.
There's Max Zander joining us from Kyiv. Many thanks. For more on the situation in Bakhmut, let's bring in Mike Martin. He's an expert on war and conflict and a senior visiting fellow at King's College in London. Good to see you again. Now, the situation in Bakhmut is horrific. We saw it in that report. But Ukraine's military says holding the city is a military necessity. This is already the longest running and bloodiest battle of the war. How much longer can that go on?
I think by any reasonable analysis, Bakhmut should already have fallen to the Russian forces, particularly when you look at the scale of resources that the Russians have thrown into it in terms of men and materiel. I think the fact that the Ukrainians are still holding it, and your correspondent, I think, spoke to this, is an amazing testament to their bravery and resilience. And they are united in the purpose of holding Bakhmut, because it gives them other options in the future on the battlefield elsewhere in Ukraine.
We've heard commanders visited the front line to solve what they call problematic issues. What are, at this point, the biggest difficulties for the Ukrainian military on the Eastern Front?
Well, around Bakhmut, the Russian forces hold three sides of the city. So they're like a sea, if you like, around the city. And the most difficult problem for the Ukrainians is supply. The Russians hold the two main roads into Bakhmut. And so the Ukrainians have had to get there ammunition in and casualties out along different supply routes. So that's the biggest problem that they're facing at the moment.
Let's talk about supplies of different kind. Germany and also Britain have now delivered heavy battle tanks to Ukraine. What does that mean for the fighters on the front lines?
Well, it means very little specifically for Bakhmut because you don't want to use tanks in an urban area because they're very vulnerable to ambush. So what's happening is Bakhmut is being held and the tanks are being prepared, the crews trained, the formations brought together so that the Ukrainians can launch a counteroffensive somewhere else in Ukraine. So that's the significance of the tanks and the armoured vehicles that have come from the West over the recent months.
Ukraine has accused Russia of taking Belarus hostage by stationing nuclear weapons there, tactical nuclear weapons, as was announced a couple of days ago. How destabilizing could Putin's move be for Belarus?
I don't think it's that destabilizing. I think we've seen a lot of this over the year of the conflict, with Putin threatening, to move nuclear weapons around, to use them. I think there's a very interesting statement from China once this was announced that Putin was going to be storing these weapons in Belarus. China reiterated that all nuclear states affirmed that the use of nuclear weapons is untenable, no nuclear wars can be won. I really think this is just more bluster from Putin. It doesn't actually mean anything for the battlefield.
Right, Martin, many thanks.
Thank you.